So my name is Clara Rosine. I'm professor of history, assistant professor of history and classics at Providence College. I'll be coming to Yale Slavic next year. And I'm very excited to introduce Giuliana D'Oro, zooming in all the way from Italy. Thank you so much, Giuliana, for being willing to zoom in at night. You know, when you should be relaxing, maybe watching some Netflix. So Giuliana D'Oro was born in the Sorrento Peninsula in the province of Naples, but moved to Rome for her studies. She still lives in Rome today. She is a PhD student in Germanic and Slavic Studies, and she graduated with a degree in Linguistic, Literary, and Translation Sciences in March 2018 from the University of Rome, with a thesis entitled Semantic Fields, Themes, Motives, and Intertextual Relations in Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. During her BA and MA degree courses, she spent some time studying abroad in Vienna, Tomsk, Berlin, and Yaroslavl, thanks to the Erasmus and extra-European mobility programs. She's also carried out research at the ICATAT Center in Magdeburg, Germany, and participated in seminars and conferences in Italy and many places abroad throughout Europe, especially. From September to December 2019, she studied in Moscow, working at the Russian State Library and attending a Tatar language course offered by the University of Kazan. She's also spent time in the US. In July 2020, she participated in the virtual summer research laboratory at the University of Illinois. And since September 2020, she is a visiting PhD student at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. Her current project investigates the question of multiculturalism in Russia, focusing in particular on Tatar-Russian relations and the literary production of Ismail Gasprinsky, which is the topic of her presentation today. So I hope you will all join me in welcoming Giuliana to today's presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank Professor Bozovic and all the staff of Macmillan Center for the support provided in the weeks leading up to this meeting, and Professor Rosine for the presentation. So I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Can you see it? Okay. So I have prepared this PowerPoint presentation mainly because I would like to show you some pages of Ismail Gasprinsky newspaper that I'm going to talk about today, which I collected in the National Library in St. Petersburg. My speech as my doctoral project has its topic the narrative production of Ismail Gasprinsky, one of the most important Crimean Tatar intellectual operating in the last decades of the Tsarist Empire. I wanted to talk about many things today, but despite the time allowed is not so little, the issues opened by this topic are complex and on many of which I'm still working for the final PhD thesis, ready for the next year. So I hope for those interests you will contact me or read the papers I'm writing on the argument. Ismail Gasprinsky was born in Avshikoye near Bakhchisarai in Crimea in 1851 and was one of the most important Tatar enlighteners, promoter of a cultural awakening movement within the Russian Muslim world, the so-called Jadidist movement. His main instrument was the creation of a capillary network of secular schools, which included, in addition to the study of the Quran, the teaching of the Russian language, history, geography, and sciences. Therefore, he promulgated the diffusion of a reformed school system, which over time significantly influenced the educational plans in other Muslim countries as well. In fact, Gasprinsky recognized ignorance as the main cause of the back awareness of Russian Islamic communities, which remained isolated and unaware of what was discovered and happened in Europe. As we know from the Professor Lazzarini study, during the late 1860s, officials from the Ministries of Public Education and International Affairs met with school administrators, teachers, and local notables throughout the empire to discuss the state of education among non-Russian subjects and the possibility of expanding instruction beyond current limits. Concerning education among the Tatars of Tavriceskaya gubernia, the consensus held that the government had accomplished little since 1783 to foster secular schooling and instruction, and that the quality of native Islamic schools was inferior at best. Such complaints were proffered by Russians knowledgeable of the local situation and hatred by Tatars concerned with the lack of development in the region and their Britain cultural retardation. During the heyday of Crimean Khanate, a vigorous literature culture was sustained by a generously supported network of domestic mektabs and medreses that served well the limited needs of a traditional society. The intimate association of religion and education, of course, encouraged the latter's development, as did the Islamic injunction that boys should study between the ages of 6 and 15. Through the mid-19th century, succeeding administrations showed little interest in either the quantity or quality of local Islamic schools and did nothing to foster or hinder their functioning. Only in the areas of language instruction and teacher preparation did the government fitfully develop programs and allocate some public funds. Thus, between 1824 and 1854, several projects were drawn up to introduce study of Russian and secular subjects into some Islamic schools, while establishing a Tatar section within the Simferopol Gymnasium with the instruction of and in the Tatar language. The impediments to full implementation of the various proposals were multiple: underfunding, lack of Tatar texts for classroom use, and widespread suspicion among Tatars of the government's motives for encouraging the study of Russian. As a result, all but a tiny number of Russianized natives refused to send their children to the few Russian-sponsored schools or to permit Russian instruction in native institutions. Ismail Gasprinsky was certainly one of the intellectuals who contributed most to the definition and systematization of the Tatar culture, and who made it possible understanding the relationship of cooperation and cultural encounter established between the Russians and the Tatars. In fact, through the study of his literary and journalistic production, the figure of Gasprinsky seems to place himself not in a colonialist imperialist dimension, but in a dialogical perspective and under the banner of interaction and intercultural collaboration with the Russian state. In fact, in his literary and journalistic works, Gasprinsky constantly emphasizes the need for unity and solidarity of the Muslim of Russia, in view of an impossible modernization, if not through dialogue and cooperation with the empire. In order to understand the context in which Gasprinsky operates, it should be clear that between the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, the Tsarist Empire had legally codified the category of inarodtsi, alien, considered as a separate body distinct from Russian unity. Although the first attempts to codify inarodtsi as a legal status are traced back to a draft regulation of 1798 called the Projekt Ustava o sibirskich inarodtsev, the term reached the legal fixity only in 1822, when the general governor of Siberia, Mikhail Speransky, who codified a series of administrative reforms in the Ustav об управлении инородцев. The definition of these peoples as inarodtsi conferred rights on minorities, for example, a certain type of self-government, but also a series of limitations. This inevitably caused a condition of isolation, of apathy, of no interest in the Russian state, of which yet they were an integral part. Therefore, the request that Gasprinsky constantly places not only on the Islamic communities, but also on the Russian state, is to collaborate in view of a socio-cultural development, building a Russian-Eastern agreement, title of one of his most famous essay, Rusko-Vostochne Soglashenie. The main tool chosen by Gasprinsky in order to disseminating his ideas was the bilingual Russian-Tatar newspaper Perevodchik-Tercüman, that with an encyclopedic character on the social and cultural life of the Crimean Tatars had as its goal the promotion of mutual understanding between the two cultures. It consists of 4 pages, 2 written in Russian and 2, as you can see, in Turkey language, a language that Gasprinsky proposed as common to all Turkish speakers, a simplified version of Ottoman Turkish, enriched by words coming mostly from Crimean Tatar. Published from 1883 to 1918, it should be noted that Perevodchik-Tercüman from 1905, it was published exclusively in Tatar language. And about this topic, I would like to open a parenthesis. The new freedoms granted by the October Manifesto also affected the Muslim press. From November onwards, numerous newspapers and journals appeared and no longer needed the prior approval of the censors in order to be published. They specialized in politics and social satire and discussed topics that had been formally prohibited until then. Tercüman also began to be published free of censorship, and by the end of 1905 became monolingual, ceasing publication of the Russian part. The new situation led to the birth of over 40 Muslim periodicals in 1906. For Gasprinsky, the goal of linguistic unity went beyond purely practical purposes. The adoption of a common written language would have symbolized and sealed until the unity of all Turkish-speaking people in a nation based on linguistic unity, as Gasprinsky had always hoped. From 1905, Gasprinsky will take shape in strengthening the unity of the Turkish Muslim nation in Russia through the common language. His motto, Dilde Fikir Deve İşte Birlik, that means unity in language, thought, and action, summed up well Gasprinsky's desires for the Muslim nation and hinted at his concern in this regard. Gasprinsky had been advocating the necessity of creating a common Turkish language since the beginning of his career, but he had never spoken openly about it in the pages of newspaper because of censorship, limiting himself to a series of implicit references in this regard. He therefore aspired the Turkish Muslim nation united in the way it writes, speaks, thinks, and acts. If, like the Russians, apart from the local dialects, the Turkish speakers had a common and official literary language, this would have sanctioned a certain degree of development on their part, legitimizing their identity and the fact that as a community they were capable of a cultural progress like other peoples. Gasprinsky was therefore taken aback by the linguistic particularism that emerged in 1905, for he expected that the simplification and refinement of the literary variants that had emerged in the past 20 years would lead to a natural convergence represented by the Turkey language. Gasprinsky also supported this cause in the Third Congress of Muslim of Russia, during which was adopted a resolution requiring the compulsory study of a common Turkish literary language in the more advanced classes of the mektebs. There is no evidence, however, that the measure was put into practice. In any case, these settlements were only temporary. In the following years, that began as a linguistic dispute turned into a dispute over the identity of the Russian Muslim, which challenged the very concept of nationhood advocated by Gasprinsky, placing ethnic identity such as the Tatar, Bashkir, Azerian, etc., at the center of the issue instead of Turkish Muslim identity. Although Gasprinsky never abandoned the idea of a common literary language that would be understandable in his words from Kasimov to Kashgar, his efforts in this regard were inconclusive. Certainly, the idea gained a certain popularity among Muslim intellectuals and gained a certain approval within the Third Congress, but the scenario that emerged in the following years made any prospect of realizing this ambition fade away. The reactionary turn of the Russian government also hindered its development. In 1907, the Ministry of Education established that the language of instruction in Muslim elementary school had to be the mother tongue of the scholars, understood as a local dialect variant, thus sabotaging any measure of the teaching of literary Turkish. The language issue remained unresolved until the revolution of 1917, if not until the advent of the Soviet power, which proved to be a decisive factor in the emergence of the various national languages. In any case, the Gasprinsky's modernizing activity had a great impact on the cultural and linguistic development of the Turkish-speaking peoples of the Russian Empire, regardless of the outcomes and developments of the years after 1905 and 1917. Although the news of 1905 offered Gasprinsky the favorable circumstances to articulate his ideas more clearly in the pages of Tercüman, the Tatar educator always maintained a sober and a moderate line, never in contradiction with what had been expressed in the pages of the newspaper up to the time, and never in contradiction with the Tsarist authority. Back to the main topic, Perevodchik's first number was published two days after the centennial anniversary of Russia's annexation of the Crimea. And in a lead article hailing the important event of 100 years earlier, Gasprinsky noted how, and you can read it in Russian in the slide, on April 8, 1783, the small khanate, worn out by disorder and bloodshed, was made a part of the greatest empire in the world, and under the patronage of a mighty power, received peace and protection of just laws. This day, a day of joy for all Russians, because with the annexation of the Crimea to Russia, much increased strength in the countries of the south and east. Although these words of gratitude expressed by Gasprinsky may have been uttered to win the favor of the government for the publication of the newspaper to continue, in his numerous articles, Gasprinsky always analyzed and criticized, proposing suggestions and alternatives, the political strategies of Russia towards the Tatar inhabitants, and more generally, the Muslim of the empire, especially regarding the educational aspect. Following the line of thought that belonged to Bakhtin and many other intellectuals, what is understood by reading Gasprinsky's article and literary works for the educator, the best way to overcome ethnic and religious differences was through the dialogue between cultures. According to Bakhtin, as we know, culture is a form of communication between people who have different visions of the world and exists only where there are at least two points of view, where there is a dialogue. The ethnocultural heterogeneity of Crimea seems to be the perfect space to start a reflection on understanding, dialogue, and creation, if we can say so, of multiple polyvalent identity, a concept to which we will return shortly. Being precisely Crimea, a pluricultural space given by the presence and therefore mutual influence of different cultures, irreducible to one-dimensional ethnicity. The problem of intercultural dialogue has always been particularly relevant in this space in Crimea, and Gasprinsky has sensed it. The extraordinary and troubled history of Crimea has seen the alternation of numerous people and cultures: Tauri, Cimmerian, Scythian, Greeks, Goths, Alan, experimenting the Roman, Byzantine, Mongolian, Ottoman, and finally Russian dominions, becoming center and periphery, a bridge between the sea and the steppe, prosperous and decadent, becoming a mosaic that has made heterogeneity its fundamental characteristic. Gasprinsky, professing Sunni Islamic faith, while sharing the fundamental tenets of the Quran, at the same time supported the interaction between science and religion. It was precisely in the synthesis of scientific and technological European progress and of Muslim religious spirituality that he saw a promising path for the development of Russian Islamic society. Thus, he translated his opinion into a series of novels, epistolary, and yet of a genre that is difficult to classify, ranging from utopian to psychological to magical realistic, and published in installment in the newspaper Perevodchik-Tercüman in both Russian and Tatar language. This is defined by some scholars as the Mullah Abbas cycle, from the pseudonym used by Gasprinsky when the novels were published. The starting idea was born from reporting the impressions of the writer's trip between 1871 and 1875 to France, Hungary, Spain, and the Middle East to visit the sacred places for Muslims. So the action starts from the novel Francuski Pisma, French Letters, published from 1887 to 1889, 12 years after the author's stay in France. The last part of French Letters, Strana Spokojstva, dedicated to the young mullah's stay in Spain, opens to what will be published from 1903 to 1905 as an independent novel entitled Tainzvena Strana, The Mysterious Country. Following the writer's journey between Europe and Middle East, were published Afrikanskie Pisma, African Letters, in 1889, and Strana Amazonok, The Land of the Amazons, between 1819 and 1891. These short novels are characterized by letters, travel notes, diaries, to be considered as pieces of a single detailed novel. The destiny of the Islamic world is the central note of this cycle of novels. In fact, Gasprinsky not only sets out to tell what he experienced firsthand, but reveals his attitude towards present issues and problems. The narrative is conducted by the young Mullah Abbas, whose eyes are open to the Western world, a West that is constantly confronted with the Turkish world, whose he reveals weakness and back-awareness. The novel's added value is that it narrates from the Russian Muslim point of view, an other gaze that observes and judges everything it sees as representing a different culture, would seem completely alien to the European mentality. The perception of others, as well as the description of reality, pass through the filter of the Muslim mentality, so called by the author, which inevitably conditions the narration. And yet, especially for a reader not belonging to that mentality, to which one approaches gradually, the novel appears even more interesting. The Western world is illuminated by the gaze of Gasprinsky, who translates it, makes it his own, and allows us to enjoy it from a new and different perspective. While not questioning Muslim culture, Mullah Abbas is fairly objective in assessing the moral qualities of Europeans, the consequences of their creative and destructive activities. In fact, after crossing the Pyrenees, the protagonist arrives to Spain, following the traces of the highest Islamic culture. However, the Iberian Peninsula disappoints the traveler. Comparing France and Spain, the protagonist notes how the Spaniard did not take advantage of the historical cultural heritage inherited from the Andalusian Caliphate, and how in the following centuries they were heavily corrupted by American gold, whose easy extraction, although it had given them wealth and supremacy for a short time, it deprived them of the energy necessary for education, which gave them a reputation as lazy and idle. Crossing the Pyrenees, therefore, Thais Vinestrana tells of the protagonist's stay in Granada, in the Alhambra, the palace of the former rulers of the Spanish Caliphate. Molabas literally falls into the Muslim ideal country of happiness, presumably founded by the Arabs after the fall of the Andalusian Caliphate, digging tunnels in the impassable mountains. In an atmosphere typical of magical realism, an enlightened country opens up to the young mullah's eyes, much more advanced than Western countries, while maintaining in its pristine purity the high morality of Muslim, their language and customs. Representing an ideal Muslim society, the novel can be defined as social, psychological, and utopian. The emergence of this genre of novel in the Russian-Turkish culture deserves, in my opinion, particular attention. Although not devoid of contradictions and naivety, Thais Vinestrana is a unique example of utopian socialism in the East. The utopian socialism literary works are an inevitable product of the development of social thought in the transition phase to a higher form of social relations. The revolution of 1905, in fact, found the Muslim of Russia in the middle of a process of transformation, still incomplete, towards a modern society. This movement of cultural awakening and enlightenment of Tatar people, which was initiated by Gasparinski and who found in Perevodchik-Tercüman a stage for reflection and debate, gradually introduced the ethno-cultural denotations of Tatar national self-identification, starting from the intelligentsia, and aimed to reach the masses through a reform of the educational system. In this context, one of the most tenacious battles that Gasprinsky fought was for women's rights. In fact, it was unthinkable for the intellectual to have a modern society that did not take into account the education and socio-cultural activities of women. After long struggles in 1906, he managed to entrust the direction of a periodical called Alem in Isvan, the World of Women, to his daughter, Shefika Gasprinskaya, dedicated entirely to the education and problems of women. At that time, it was the first and probably only such publication aimed at Muslim women in Russia. Gasprinsky himself dedicated to the female question numerous articles and short stories published in Perevodchik-Tercüman, including one of the novels belonging to the cycle of Mullah Abbas, Strana Amazonok, the land of the Amazons. The protagonist tells how he and 6 other travelers during a journey along the desert were surprised by a sandstorm, following which they were taken prisoners by the warriors of the Amazon. As an adventure and anti-utopian novel, Strana Amazonok describes the Muslim society of the 19th century by reversing its roles. Men represented as oppressed and discriminated who take care of the children and the house, while women, strong and courageous heroines, are the only ones to have weight and usefulness in the society. Strana Amazonok offers a visit to a fantastic country of women located in the Sahara Desert, a bitter satire on the oppression of women in the Islamic society of Russia. Gasprinsky openly criticizes the literary application of Sharia law in marriage and family disputes, and imaginated that the emancipation of women involved also their active participation in public life. So what Gasprinsky did with his newspaper, Perevodchik-Tercüman, was an act of cultural translation, in which the creation of a particular genre, such as that of the novels I have briefly described, becomes a political act of mediation and communication, which challenges the existing power structures within much wider social and cultural contexts, paying attention to ideological values, cultural, economic, and political inequalities, as well as individual choices. The creation of literary works difficult to identify with this hybrid genre, explicit in most of Ismail Gasprinsky literary production, reflects his polyvalent identity, a concept elaborated by Professor Zekian from University of Venice regarding the Armenians, but that I think could be applied to Gasprinsky's personality. Fully Tatar and at the same time, fully Russian. Cultural polyvalence occurs in a frontier situation where by frontier, I mean a political and social context in which there is a multi-referentiality allowed by a dynamic of active and polyvalent assimilation. In our case, the land that once belonged to Gasprinsky, Crimea, is functional to the discourse of the Russian multicultural universe, not only thanks to its geographical location, peripheral to Russia and reaching out towards the West, but to the ethno-cultural melting pot of population it hosts, created mainly by the numerous migratory waves that took place between the end of the 18th and throughout the 19th century. In this context, Gasprinsky proposed dialogue as the only viable way to rediscuss and redefine values and beliefs, behaviors and lifestyle. His journalistic and literary production is aimed at the main objective, which is to overcome differences and borders, to move from a limited cultural and political condition to another one, to share with the Russian people. Gasprinsky's socio-psychological and utopian novels are therefore configured not only as example of a particular literary genre, but as an important pillars within cultural studies, contributing to the creation of this multiple polyvalent Tatar identity in the context of multicultural Russia. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Giuliana. It was a really, of course I'd seen it before, but it's always interesting to see these presentations happening live. So I'm going to give, hopefully I won't take too long, giving a few of my many questions, and then after that I'll open up for questions from the audience. So my first question concerns language, which is a big part both of your analysis and a big preoccupation for Gasprinsky himself. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what Gasparelli means when he says he wants to create a modern Turkey language. For him, what makes the language modern? Is it grammar? Is it script? Is it mutual comprehensibility between different parts of the Turkic world? And what's the payoff for Gasprinsky in developing a shared, simplified, modern Turkey language? So that's my first question. So the second question concerns the dynamics of time and space in Gasprinsky's works. So as you've described him here, Gasprinsky, like many of the other Jadid thinkers who will follow him, he adheres to a really strong linear notion of progress, that there are some people who are backward, who need to be brought into the modern world. And so when Gasprinsky, in his fictional works, when he travels to different places, when he travels in space, he's also traveling in time. So in Spain, he's returning to the past glories of Umayyad Spain and Islamic Spain. When he travels to France, he's getting a taste of the future. So I had a couple questions around this issue. First, I think it's interesting and worth comment that Gasprinsky's journeys center on Western Europe, on France and Spain, not markedly Russia. So why do you think it is Western Europe that he's most interested in? If there's this kind of cultural continuum from backward to modern, where does Russia fit in? Is Russia somehow backward, or is it an aspired to modernity? How does non-Muslim Russia compare to the Crimean Tatar environment in which he's working? And again, I have a few questions, and I do not expect you to answer them all now, but I hope that you can use them as food for thought and maybe fodder for future conversations as well. Third, I'd be interested to hear about some of a little bit more of the literary conversations that Gasprinsky is a part of. I'm especially interested in his use of this genre of the sort of speculative travel narrative, given that there's a long history of speculative fiction and travel literature in the Islamic world, but also the very robust tradition of utopian and speculative fiction in Russia. I'm thinking of someone like Chernyshevsky. So what are some of the interlocutors that Gasprinsky has in mind when he writes works in this genre? And finally, and this is, I'll hold off after this. When you conclude in your presentation, you conclude that Gasprinsky was fully Russian and fully Tatar. I'd like to ask a little bit more about what that means for you and what that means for Gasprinsky. So first, I'd like to understand what Tatar means to someone like Gasprinsky. In what context does Gasprinsky discuss himself as a Tatar versus a Turk? What does Tatarness mean? And there's also some slippage in your presentation between Turkic Muslimness and Turkicness. So what does it mean for Gasprinsky to be Tatar? Second, Russian. What does it mean for Gasprinsky to be Russian? On the one hand, and you mentioned this in your abstract for the talk, Russians are Russian missionaries, Russian bureaucrats are very interested in sblizhenie, in becoming closer between, in other words, Tatars becoming closer to Russians. This is a rallying cry for the Illuminated method missionary schools, for example. But I suspect that when Gasprinsky if Gasprinsky is fully Russian, if Gasprinsky speaks of himself as Russian, he's not speaking of himself as Russian in the Illuminated method sense that he's becoming Orthodox. Absolutely not. And this got me thinking about, the fact that Gasprinsky, writing in Crimea in conversation with Ottoman thinkers at the same time, whether Gasprinsky might be articulating a kind of civic Russian identity, similarly to the way that Ottoman thinkers are articulating a civic Ottomanism. So not a religious identity, not an ethno-national cultural identity, but a civic vision of Russianness that could encompass diverse religious and cultural positions. So is he imagining a new kind of Rossiskus, maybe, rather than Russianness in the Ruski sense? Yes, I know that's a lot of questions, so I'll stop there, and I will not ask you to answer all of them, but whatever seems most promising.
Thank you. I will try to answer. So first of all, regarding the language. So Gasprinsky, considered the founder of modern Turkology and Pan-Turkism, edited the most influential and enduring newspaper of this period, so the Perevodchik-Tercüman. And there he tried to seek to establish a simplified written Turkish language as the common literary language of a wide reading public that by the late 19th century stretched from Istanbul through Caucasia and Turkestan. So in this serialized novel, the Molla Abbas cycle, which thematized the translative travel of Turkish across other languages, most notably French and Spain, the language constitutes an important archive of not only the register, but also the imagination of the Turkish language itself as a medium. So through the reading of this serialized novel, I think Gasprinsky imagined the Turkish language as an unheimlich force linking its user to unseen and unheard places rather than as an homogeneous empty medium. So if Gasprinsky's writings gave way to a discourse of Muslim Turkish identitarism, maybe we can ascribe that to his profound enchantment with the fear and the fear of an overwhelming translative Turkish producing unpredictable effects. So the Turkish language, this new kind of language, the Turkey language, maybe can see as a medium through other languages and other culture. Then, so regarding the question about intertextual relationship that Gasprinsky, right? First of all, Gasprinsky received an education, an European education. He lived in France, spoke French, studied French canonical literature of the 18th century. And so the intertextual relationship that Gasprinsky constructs and therefore the influences he has received are numerous. In his works, especially in the cycle of Molla Abbas, intertextual relationships are evident with, for example, Rousseau, New Eloise, Karamzin, Letter of a Russian Traveler, as you said, Chernyshevsky, What is to be Done, Tommaso Campanella, and so on. So about the sblizhenie and relations with also the Ilminsky point of view about the question, this issue is really important, as you can say, and I will try to focus on in this last year of research, but is really an intricate story that shows the social, cultural, and political composition of the Muslim of Russia Empire. and how they changed toward the end of the imperial regime. So the works of these two personalities, Gasprinsky and Ilminsky, were instrumental in this change. Gasprinsky wanted the Muslim of the empire to modernize without losing their Muslim identities, to contact the outside world beyond their local communities, either Muslim or Russian, to unite culturally and later to translate this union into a political action. And this, I think this maybe answer also to the question of what does Tatar means for Gasprinsky, what does Russian means to Gasprinsky. Being fully Tatar and fully Russian is a really complicated issue, really. But I believe that reading his works, his stories, his article, it is clear that despite the fact that the aim of Gasprinsky was to unite all these Muslim inside and outside Russia under a single nation, a single millet, the strong dialogical intercultural exchange, this mutual influence, this sblizhenie, as you can say, sblizhenie russkich Tatar, is really clear and cannot be denied. Yeah, I don't know if I answered all the questions, but it's a bit complicated to remember all of them.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for you. I think you tackled all my questions. So yeah, it's good to hear your thoughts. I think this is a good time to open it up to the attendees. So if any of you who are out there in the Zoom world, even though we can't see your faces, we can see your questions if you type them in the chat or in the Q&A. We'd be happy to take your questions now. All right, here's one in the Q&A from Marietta Bojovic. She says, thank you for the fascinating talk. I'm struck by your topic from the angle of periodical studies. The turn of the early 20th century was the era of little magazines, avant-garde journals, and other surprisingly influential collective publications. The newspaper is a creative production, a text, an object, a space, a platform, a fundraising tool, a social network avant la lettre. How might this periodical project, in your opinion, be compared to other periodical experiments of the time?
So yes, as we know, Perevodchik-Tercüman was not the only newspaper or periodical in Turkey language or in non-Russian press, but differently from, for example, the journal, the newspaper Shura, Gasprinsky proposed in Tercüman Perevodchik a unique example of this kind of press characterized by this encyclopedical character, with the aim of mutual understanding between these two cultures. And I think was really a unique example of this kind of publication, even if this the panorama, the scenario in which Gasprinsky is included, I think I must be focused in the next year because it's a really important issue and of great interest, of course.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? All right, while others are thinking, I'm going to go ahead and take my moderator's privilege and ask another one. You mentioned utopian socialism with reference to one of the fiction works published in Tatar-Russian. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Gasprinsky's political vision. What kind of political order is he envisioning? I think you also mentioned constitutionalism at some time. If he's imagining an utopia, a utopia, what would his utopian state look like?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, in Tezvenaya Strana, Gasprinsky represents this ideal Muslim society, which is really close to the, as I said, Rousseau New Eloise Clarence image, because it is this big city organized without societies, without prisons, without sufferance, and it's a bit how to say, naive and sometimes not. It does not have like proper basis of utopian socialism as the other works, for example, I don't know, the society of Rousseau or Campanella and the other one. But the social and political structure of this mysterious country is universal, since the so-called Eastern element and its tradition do not form its basis. Albeit isolated, the inhabitants of the mysterious country live in the hope that one day the people will unite, because technological innovations, development, and knowledge will have transformed the whole world into a single country of humanity, in which the land, the culture, now presented as something special and distant, as this mysterious country named Rahat, and one day will be understood as member of same family. So the future of society, not only Muslim, is to be sought in this heterogeneous reality founded on social relations. This is the main topic of this novel.
Thank you. I think we have time for one, maybe two questions if people are especially eager. Any questions? All right. Again, from Marietta Božović, can you tell us a bit more about this project in the context of your research more broadly? How did you come to this topic, and where do you see yourself going next?
So my first contact with the Tatar world actually was not in Crimea, but in Tatarstan, in Kazan. I was in Russia for a study stay and was fascinated by the Tatar culture, so much so that I wanted to learn more about it. And then my PhD course in Germanic and Slavic Studies then led me to build a project initially conceived on Tatar-German relations, starting from the literature produced by Tatar immigrants in Germany during the 20th century. But then the study of Tatar culture introduced me to Ismail Gasprinski, who completely fascinated me, and I decided to make him the focus of my research. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic situation, I wasn't able to go to Simferopol, but I really hope to make up for it soon.
Okay, any last questions before we wrap up for the day? All right, well, thank you to all of you who came on this sunny Thursday afternoon, at least if you're in Connecticut. Thank you very much to Giuliana for zooming in from a place that is currently not sunny, and I appreciate your taking the time out of your evening to join us today. Let's all give Giuliana a virtual round of applause before we close for the day. And we wish you all the best of luck in your last year of research on this project.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.